Welcome, everyone. My name is Akasemi Newsome, and I'm Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies. We're honored today to have Professor Jean Beaman as our noontime lecturer. Her lecture is under the auspices of our newly created Center for Excellence in French and Francophone Studies, supported by the French Embassy to France. Now, a bit about our speaker. The title of her talk is Towards a Reading of Black Lives Matter in France, Diasporic Connections in Global Social Movements. Professor Beaman is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, with affiliations in Black Studies, Political Science, Feminist Studies, Global Studies, and the Center for Black Studies Research. Her research is ethnographic in nature and focuses on race and ethnicity, racism, international migration, and state violence in both France and the United States. She's the author of Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France, which came out at the University of California Press in 2017. An excellent book that you should all go out and purchase, as I was privileged to review it. She's also a fellow for the year of 2022 to 2023 at Stanford Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, and was co-PI for the Mellon Foundation Sawyer Seminar Grant, Race, Precarity, and Privilege, Migration in a Global Context for 2020-2022. Please join me here in the room and on Zoom in giving Professor Beaman a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Akasemi and Ray, for this kind invitation, and thank you all for being here virtually and in situ. So I'll dive right in. Okay. So what I'm going to talk through today is based on my book in progress that I'm working on. This is very much a work in progress, which is tentatively entitled Suspect Citizenship, Racism and State Violence in France and the World, in which I argue the specter of state violence renders certain populations as permanently suspect or suspicious, forever marginalized and incapable of being assumed into mainstream society. So in this book, I examine suspect citizenship at the nexus between active citizenship, belonging and non-belonging, anti-racism at a macro level, and activism and mobilization against state violence and racism. So specifically in the book, this is the chapter outline, I discuss the contours of state violence in France, the work that state violence does, theorizing state violence outside of specific killings to overall questions of surveillance and policing, the goals and aims of the social movement, how activists frame the social problem of state violence, the transnational resonance of Black Lives Matter and the global connections activists make with anti-racist struggles elsewhere, the role of Black feminism and intersectionality as Black women are often the face of present anti-racist struggles, and how they therefore think about their status as Black women within France, and considering how anti-racism operates and can operate outside of codified and recognized ethno-racial categorization. So what I'm going to present today is based on chapter 4 of this book on these diasporic connections anti-racist activists make with social movements elsewhere, specifically focusing on how Black Lives Matter is read and interpreted within France, and how we should make sense of the connections between Black Lives Matter and longstanding anti-racist struggles in France. So in doing so, I'm thinking through how France, both historically and presently, does not value Black lives, how for activists that is both a local and global conversation, and how present mobilization against racism and state violence is in conversation with some of these movements. More broadly, I discuss how to understand or read Black Lives Matter, not just in France, but in Europe more broadly, and how we should make sense of these connections between Black Lives Matter and longstanding anti-racist struggles, both within and across Europe. Okay. So my current book is based on ethnographic research in the Parisian metropolitan region. Conducted between 2017 and 2022, interrupted at various points due to COVID-19. This includes 47 interviews with activists involved broadly speaking, and mobilization against police violence, including individuals who are associated with different collectifs or organizations, as well as journalists who report on some of these issues, and family members of victims of police violence, some of whom are activists themselves. Most of the people I engage with in my fieldwork are visible minorities, mainly either Maghrébin, West African origin, or Caribbean origin, as in descendants of immigrants from former French colonies and overseas deportement in these regions. I've connected with individuals through various collectifs and organizations, existing networks, and social media pages, and I'm happy to share more about that in the Q&A. I conduct all my interviews in French and then have them transcribed by a native French speaker. I then do all the translations myself. I've also conducted participant observation with different organizations at demonstrations related to police violence and anti-racism, as well as organizational meetings, activist trainings, and other types of related events. So my method is deeply informed by a Black feminist epistemology, which takes seriously my standpoint as a Black woman conducting this research. In my earlier work, I've written about how my identity as non-French and as a Black American US citizen has been implicated in conducting ethnographic research, namely in my relations with my interlocutors, some of whom perceived an insider connection with me as a fellow ethno-racial minority. So far, this has remained the case with my current work, particularly as individuals reference my own identity or their perception of my own identity as a Black American living in this era of Black Lives Matter. And this is a photo I took at a 2018 demonstration for Adama Traoré, who was killed by the police in 2016. And I should also note that I took the majority of the photos in this talk, which I also see as part of my ethnographic method. So I wanted to say a bit about the context about race and racism in France and kind of what I mean when I say that race and ethnicity do not quote unquote exist. So I want to briefly discuss Republican ideology, and I apologize it's a little pedantic, but just to make sure we're on the same page. So French republicanism emphasizes the relationship between individuals and the state over any other group categorization or identity. Being French is supposed to supersede any other identification, be it linguistic, religious, or ethnic. Race is not considered a legitimate category by the state. It is not measured in the French census. And recently, the word race was removed from the French Constitution. Talking about race or even using the literal word is seen to exacerbate racism. And in fact, the United States is often characterized as an example of dangers that can occur when such differences are acknowledged. France therefore imagines and continually constructs itself as colorblind and race neutral. This is reflected, for example, in how the French can celebrate, in quotation marks, African-American expatriates such as James Baldwin, Chester Himes, or Josephine Baker, who were all supposedly able to feel freer in France than they ever could in a racist United States. Yet despite the Republican emphasis on the renunciation of ethno-racial categorization, many scholars of French colonial history in particular have argued that France has long relied on racial and ethnic boundaries in constructing its national identity. Since France has a long history of colonial slavery, colonialism, and related subsequent migration to the metropole, it is necessary to understand how individuals who are descendants of these structures fare in contemporary French society in light of these histories. This has also been reflected in scholarly treatments on race and racism in France and Europe more broadly. For example, Franz Fanon wrote in Black Skin, White Mask of how the European has a fixed concept of a Negro, and therefore how Blacks in France are not seen as of France or capable to be seen as of France. We can also point to Putnam Guy, who's discussed how Blacks in France are paradoxically and simultaneously visible and invisible. And Trigger Keaton, who has argued that France's race blindness is coupled with race-based assumptions, which lead to a consciousness of race. In my work, I extend, and I try work and also current work, I extend Ami and Weinelt's framework of the racial project to the French context. This framework allows me to consider how individuals are marked as different and inferior without state-level categories of recognition. David Theo Goldberg's framework of racial Europeanization is also helpful, focusing on how race is seen as a problem everywhere but in Europe, or is instead often framed as exceptional or related to phenomena of the past, such as the Holocaust. And Europe itself is there framed as an example of quote-unquote political racelessness. I'm also influenced by Stephen Small's conceptualization of Black Europe, which among other things demonstrates how Black people throughout Europe are seen as quote-unquote permanent strangers, and Nicholas G. Genova's conceptualization of Blackness as, quote, a racialized socio-political category that can be understood to encompass the full spectrum of social identities produced as specifically non-white, end quote. What is clear here in this very, very rapid summary is how race and ethnicity are taboo to discuss, yet as meth research has shown, omnipresent in the lives of individuals marked as non-white. Even a society very differently organized from the United States, which of course does measure these categories and at least pretends to acknowledge and respect multiculturalism, racial meanings are still articulated and hierarchies based on those meanings are still applied. So by using the term state violence in my book project, my focus here is not just on police violence or deaths or specific deaths or brutality by the police, but also as a way to think through how the state is involved in the systematic devaluing of certain populations. So French anthropologist Didier Fasson has argued that the police act as the agent of the state to maintain ethno-racial boundaries in the absence of state-level categories. In recent years, there has been growing attention to the quote-unquote tense relations between the police and ethno-racial minorities, including hyper-surveillance of these minorities, some of which leads to death. French political scientist Fabien Jobard has demonstrated how the contrôle d'identité, or identity checks by the police, disproportionately target visible minorities. Anthropologist Paul Silverstein has maintained that these identity checks are a kind of citizenship surveillance in which a quote-unquote second-order citizenship is maintained. A 2012 Human Rights Watch report found the majority of visible minorities in France reported identity checks by the police as a major problem. They are 6 to 8 times more likely than quote-unquote whites to experience these pat-downs. As to actual deaths, estimates vary widely, but one estimate states that there are about 10 to 15 deaths per year due to the police. So one example of this violence was the fall of 2005 uprisings throughout many of France's banlieues or suburban outskirts. In this case, Saïd Bana, a 17-year-old of Tunisian origin, and Beno Traoré, a 15-year-old of Malayan origin, pictured here, were electrocuted in a substation as they fled police in Clichy-sous-Bois, a Parisian banlieue. They are apparently trying to avoid the constant identity checks by the police. At the time, outrage about their deaths led to uprisings throughout France, which lasted a few weeks. Then President Jacques Chirac declared a state of emergency. And then Interior Minister and then later President Nicolas Sarkozy called the individuals involved in the uprisings racailles or scum, and suggested cleaning the streets of the banlieue with a crachir, a brand of a high-pressure water hose. The police involved in the deaths of Saïd and Bana were cleared of all charges over a decade later. While these uprisings received much national and international media attention, including lots of images of cars and buildings on fire, what was often missed was how the deaths of these two ethnic minority youth were due to hypersurveillance by the police and are therefore an example of state violence. And in fact, the 2005 uprisings are illustrative of suspect citizenship, or how certain populations within France are necessarily rendered suspicious or suspect. Throughout my fieldwork, activists mentioned how important this 2005 moment was for driving them to become activists, particularly as many of the conditions that led to Saïd and Bana's death have not changed. In this way, the 2005 uprisings were a quote-unquote critical juncture, or a distinctive moment in which different ideologies and arrangements are forged, making it difficult to return to a period before such changes. Great, you're like already predicting, great. So now I just want to introduce a few people I've encountered through my ethnographic work. This is Ramada Jiang, a 45-year-old woman, picture here, who I first met in 2017. On June 17, 2007, her brother Lenin Jiang, a 25-year-old of Senegalese origin, died following a struggle with multiple police officers in the 20th arrondissement, not too far from the famous Père Lachaise cemetery. Lenin was restrained face down on the street with his hands tied behind his back and his feet strapped together. He was then taken to a police station, and by the time he arrived at the police station, he was taken to a police van, and by the time the van arrived at the police station, he was no longer breathing. The medical report stated that he died of asphyxiation, yet his friends and family members ran a full investigation as well as punishment for the officers involved. And this is a photo from a 2018 demonstration for Lenin Jiang. So after her brother's death, Ramada started a collectif vivole, loosely translated as Stolen Lives, as a way to mobilize others against state violence. She wants this to be a worldwide network, connecting what's happening in France, what's happening in the United States, and around the world. Through this collectif, she and other activists align with friends and family members of other victims of state violence, and also hold yearly commemorative demonstrations each June on the anniversary of Lenin's death. During this commemorative march, Ramada recounts the events leading up to the specific events leading up to her brother's death, leaves flowers at the exact spot where he died, as well as allows family members and friends of other victims to recount their stories. And this photo was a demonstration I was a part of in July 2017, or June 2017, excuse me, what was then the 10-year anniversary of Lenin's death. Once when she and I were meeting in a park not too far from where her brother was killed, she explained the contours of this issue. She says, quote, police violence in France is really is a racial question. It is racism of the state, because when you look at the list of victims, you see that essentially more than 90% are Blacks and Arabs. The remaining 10% are activists or militants, Roma, and what we say in quotation marks as accidents. Whites only die by accident because they are not targeted, they are not the profile. There's a kind of profile for police violence, and the profile of victims is always the same profile. It is always young Black men between 20 and 40 years old, and Maghrebin or North Africans as well between 20 and 40 years old, end quote. So in that same conversation, she told me that in the United States, state violence is much worse, as there are many more victims here. Yes, she says, quote, this happens in all Western countries because it comes from the state is racist, end quote. This is but one example of how state violence is framed as a racial issue in France, despite France's denial of race and racism, as well as how activists understand state violence as a looming presence and threat. And during the same meeting with Ramada, she noted how frequently the same police officers were coming by the park where we were hanging out, harassing the same youth they had spoken to only an hour or two beforehand, speaking both to the quotidianness of police harassment and the social function it actually plays. And this image is from a 2015 poster advertising what was the 2015 Lenin Jiang demonstration. And hopefully you can recognize the references to Ferguson, Detroit, and Baltimore, and the image of Malcolm X with the quote, our objective is total liberty, total justice, total freedom by any means necessary. And the second quote is truth is on the side of the oppressed. Thank you for doing that slide, by the way. Okay, so the morning that I went to this 2017 demonstration commemorating the death of Lenin, as shown in the earlier slides, I had just read the news of the acquittal of Beaman, a Minnesota police officer who was acquitted in the July 2016 death of Lando Castile, pictured here on the left. Castile was a 32-year-old Black American who worked as a school nutrition worker and was pulled over as he drove with his girlfriend and 4-year-old daughter. His girlfriend captured the aftermath of his shooting by Yanez on Facebook Live. As I participated in the demonstration for Lenin Jiang, as well as for other victims, I thought about the parallels between state violence and in both societies. And I was not the only one thinking about these connections. The death of Michael Brown, pictured on the right, in August 2014, received much attention by anti-racist activists and others in France. After Brown's death by Officer J.R. Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri, and a grand jury declining to indict Wilson and Brown's death, residents and others protested in response, as well as to the often volatile relationship between Black Americans and the police. At the time, one officer was overheard referring to these protesters as quote unquote fucking animals, language, reminiscent of Sarkozy's rhetoric during the 2005 Banlieue uprising. And so during these protests in Ferguson, Christiane Taubira, who until July 2016 was the French Minister of Justice, said the following, quote, I will not make value judgments on the institutions of the United States, but when the sense of frustration is that strong, that deep, that long lasting, and that huge, there is reason to question whether people trust these institutions. You realize that somehow it only happens to the same people, Afro-American kids, end quote. Yet, of course, I think Taubira's statement could also apply to ethno-racial minorities within France. Many of the images of the protests in Ferguson personally reminded me of the images from the 2005 uprising. To give another example, in July 2016, Adama Traoré, a 24-year-old Black construction worker, died under unusual circumstances after being arrested in the banlieue north of Paris. The police first claimed that he had died of a heart attack and then later said he had a severe infection. Assa Traoré, pictured here under a photo of her brother, is his sister who's leading the movement for justice for Adama. Since his death, which one US media account termed quote unquote Francis Ferguson, there have been numerous demonstrations demanding justice for Adama Traoré, including one every year on the anniversary of his death. And this photo is from one such demonstration in 2018. So Assa and her family are alleging lack of assistance and willful neglect by the police as both contributing to his death, especially since he had no chronic health issues prior to his death. Before her brother's death, she was working as a teacher's assistant in a banlieue north of Paris. She has since written or co-written 2 books, the sales of which she used to seek justice for her brother. This includes paying legal fees for 4 of her other brothers, she has 17 total siblings, who have been in jail for various periods of Adama's death. She has stated publicly that her family has been under attack ever since they contested the official explanation for Adama's death. So also regularly gives talks about state violence and her brother's death, not just in France, but all over the world, and has received support from various celebrities, including French rapper Maccabi and activist scholar Angela Davis. As she explained to me when we first met in 2017, she sees this cause as not just about justice for her own brother, but for all forgotten populations throughout France, including residents of the quartiers populaires or working class neighborhoods, who know the police only as a quote unquote invading force. Once when I met with her as she was signing copies of her first book at the offices of Soul, her publisher, she explained, quote, "We don't see people like Adama as a human, a son, a brother. Even I have been controlled in these quartiers," she means the identity control checks. "What's happening is France is having an identity crisis. It wants to suppress differences, but you can't do that," end quote. So here Assa is speaking not just to the pervasiveness of state violence, here the prevalence of identity checks, but also to the ways that people like her slain brother, like her, are not understood as part of France or even as fully human. Her words also speak to the tensions inherent in French republicanism, as some differences in French society are seen as meaningful and others are not. And this image is a photo I took at a 2019 demonstration for Adama Traoré and recognized the Black Lives Matter text, and at the bottom it says, "Silence, France kills," and then the date of Adama's death. So when I first met Assa in 2017, she had paid attention both to incidents of police brutality in the United States and elsewhere, and to the growing Black Lives Matter movement. Yet this did not at all mean, or does not mean, that she and activists automatically transferred Black Lives Matter to the French context, as they are aware of the multitude of differences in structure and identity politics of Trinity Society, even if the experiences of ethno-racial minorities are very similar. At the time, she explained to me, quote, "Black Lives Matter is difficult to do here. You can't even say the word noir, Black. And all these issues, are related, undocumented immigration, etc. So we can't have a subcategory of Blacks. We can't say that undocumented immigrants are not ours, that they are not related," end quote. So I highlight Assa's understanding of Black Lives Matter here to illustrate that activists can pay attention to Black Lives Matter and incidents of state violence more broadly, while also critiquing the movement here. And this, I think, speaks to the question of what does it even mean to say Black Lives Matter in a context in which there are seemingly no quote unquote Black lives. And this image on the right is from a community event sponsored by Ferguson of Paris, which I'll talk about shortly. And these 2 individuals are actually African-American activists from St. Louis who came to Paris to discuss their experiences being involved in Black Lives Matter and the protests in Ferguson following Michael Brown's killing. Yet, especially since the 2020 death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests and demonstrations throughout much of Europe, Assa has become a face, if not the face, of France's present anti-racist movement and has been praised as such in French, US, and other international media. For example, Assa led a massive demonstration outside the High Court in Paris that more than 20,000 protesters, against state violence, including the death of her own brother, Adama, and Floyd's murder, as shown in this image here. Several protest signs invoked Black Lives Matter and quote unquote, I can't breathe, the last words of both George Floyd and Adama Traore. In a later interview with French magazine Antidote, Asa said, quote, when George Floyd died, that's our brother. They, Floyd and Traore, died the same way. I recognize myself in Black Lives Matter. We are all Black Lives Matter. Our common issue with racial discrimination. Here is over there. It is the Blacks, the non-whites, who are being killed, end quote. So considering this shift, I suggest we should not assume a quote unquote natural resonance or automatic connection with Black Lives Matter, but more importantly, pay attention to the nuances and tensions by which anti-racist activists pay attention to incidents of state violence in the United States, as well as other societies, but have their own critiques about movement ideology and tactics. So they are not at all parodying whatever comes out of the United States, but rather thinking strategically about what it means to do so. And Asa's anti-racist work, both within and outside of France, I think speaks to this. So as I've alluded to earlier, part of this anti-racist movement is invoking transnational connections with struggles for Black liberation worldwide, including Black Lives Matter, but not just Black Lives Matter, as on my title slide and the Black Lives Matter Paris sign, as well as in terms of sort of iconography and posters and chants used in different demonstrations. So hopefully on the right, you recognize the image of Rosa Parks with the translation, who will protect us by the police are everywhere and justice is nowhere. And that's a chant that's commonly used in these demonstrations. And then on the left, the sort of French version, justice for Adama, the French version sort of no justice, no peace, which requires more words in French to share. But these connections are not just found at demonstrations and protests. For example, Ferguson in Paris, a collective I'm also working with for this book, connects incidents of state violence against Black Americans with similar incidents in France through various campaigns on social media and in demonstrations. This particular collective began after Michael Brown's death in 2014 and seeks to apply the discourse and actions of Black Lives Matter, the plight of Black populations in France. So as their own Facebook page explains, they aim to show that what's happening in France is happening in the United States and all around the world. And these are some images from their Facebook page. So on the right, the Don't Shoot Ferguson in Paris, Don't Shoot being a common chant during the protests following the death of Mike Brown. And then of course, the image of Michael Brown. And then on the right, these are also images from their social media pages, police kill, and then Taya and Adama remind us why Zaid and Bono were running. So Taya was another victim of police violence. He was beaten and sodomized by local police officers. And then Zaid and Bono are from the 2005 uprisings that I spoke about earlier. And then on the right, these are all names of Black women murdered by the police. Again, these are their social media pages. And then here on the left, you see the United We Fight and Black Lives Matter and the Ferguson of Paris as well. Okay, so as one of the founders of Ferguson in Paris, Mamadou, a 32-year-old of Malayan origin who grew up just south of Paris, put it, quote, part of the reason I chose the name Ferguson in Paris is to show Ferguson, Paris, the same. It's the same thing. The contexts are not the exact same, but the pressure means are the same. These are the people who never received justice, end quote. So my main point here is that the challenge to combating state violence is doing so under the constraints of French Republican ideology. Struggles against state violence have to also be anti-racist struggles, even though there's no language, literally and figuratively, to combat racism within France. Activists can seek to connect their struggles with similar incidents elsewhere, but they're doing so in a context in which there are no quote-unquote Black lives. Black Lives Matter, as both a sort of ideology and a social movement, both presents possibilities and further reveals constraints for mobilizing against state violence in France, as race is a legitimate category upon which to make claims to the state in the United States, but it is not so in France. Ultimately, even though state violence is often framed as a racial issue, and many activists acknowledge or activate a shared consciousness with other Black populations elsewhere, they still struggle to be seen as French rather than as something other than French. So in many ways, they're critiquing the French state, but they have not fully abandoned it. As such, this transnational Blackness is limited for helping activists in France mobilize against state violence. The state activates ethno-racial boundaries through incidents such as the deaths of Zaid or Bona or Lenin or Adama, but activists are limited in what they can do about them. And as such, I argue we need to pay more attention to racial formation globally, as well as how people resist the consequences of this global racial formation. So as I've argued elsewhere, Black Lives Matter in Europe builds upon, or what we might consider Black Lives Matter in Europe, builds upon and connects to present and past anti-racist mobilizations across Europe. This includes challenging the denial of race and racism, naming racism, fighting state violence against ethno-racial minorities, and forcing Europe to grapple with its own history of slavery and colonialism, and acknowledging and affirming the presence of Black Europeans across the continent. It challenges European exceptionalism with regards to race and racism, and challenges Black Europeans' frequent designation, as permanent outsiders within Europe. It both addresses the local specificities of anti-Black racism in different European societies and travels beyond the boundaries of the nation state to emphasize the global connections regarding what it means to be racialized as Black around the world. This is not at all new, but it is crucial to pay attention to in order to understand the realities of Black populations, not just in France or Europe, but around the world. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.